Uh, Good evening, everybody. Khidirpur College, Department of Philosophy is quite privileged to organize a special lecture on feminist ethics. Today, the speaker is Dr. Ramrita Banerjee of IIT Bombay, Department of Humanities and Social Science, who will speak on a specific issue on feminist ethics, and that is care ethics. We are quite privileged to have Amrita with us. We will be definitely illuminated and enlightened by her talk, because she will be delivering her talk on care ethics, a very, very contemporary topic. We will be definitely enlightened today. Before calling the speaker, I'd like to request our respected principal sir, Dr. Abhijit Ganguly, to say a few words regarding today's webinar. I'd like to add one line in this regard, that without our respected principal sir's relentless support and encouragement, it would not have been possible for the seminar committee and all the departments to arrange this lecture series. So for that, we are absolutely grateful to our principal, Dr. Abhijit Ganguly. I now request Dr. Ganguly to say a few words as his welcome address.
Thank you, Professor Bhattacharya. Not to be mentioned, it's my duty to encourage you all time. Welcome everyone. We are all here once again with our today's webinar or invited special lecture program organized by the Department of Philosophy, Khidirpur College, on the topic named Philosophical Quandaries of Care Ethics for Transnational Feminism. And the renowned speaker, Dr. Ramrita Banerjee from the Department of Humanities and Social Science, Indian Institute of Technology, Mumbai, is here with us to deliver her lecture on this topic. I pay my hearty congratulations to Dr. Banerjee for joining with us in this occasion, and we are really privileged and anxiously waiting today for her valuable speech in this regard. However, in the arena of so many theories of postmodern feminism, and the feminist care ethics is indeed taking a very vital role day by day. The feminist care ethics is an ethic of resistance to the injustices inherent in particular. It's vastly related to the association of care or caring with women rather than with a human, and the feminization of care work. I think the rendering of care as the subsidiary to the justice, along with care against any kind of injustice on women, and no doubt it helps to hold the prestigious position of women in society and also in workplaces to promote the healthy interpersonal relationship and as much as care ethics. In the sphere of care ethics, the feminists are striving for vindication by formulating the theory entitled as ethics of care that could be also projected as ethics of justice. And in regards to the question of morality and integrity for growing up the interpersonal relationship among the women also, now why the care ethics are very much needed to our society and to the individual. We know that in the theory of transnational feminist activities or transnational feminist issues, we can see that the major numbers of concerned feminists have focused their attention on gender, languages, imperialism, colonialism, nationalism, economics, politics, race, psychology, philosophy, human rights, and many more. And around the world, when women are crossing their barrier of national boundaries and trying to enter into the social or professional field of work in collaboration with the women of other countries, then there must be a framework of strategies which can refer to equalize the practices and perspectives of women rights in whole and in the basis of its global nature also. So that in that viewpoint of strategies, the transnational feminism or feminist activities theorize and works on with its potentials. I think so. There are so many examples of feminist care ethics being used in modern times. One of the best of that is in bioethics that I have learned from internet that and that deals with the professions involved in medicine, specifically deals with caring for others. However, it's too much vast area to discuss. There are so many international processes that are increasingly developed by the non-state actors, and so many international organizations are there in regards to promote the global social theories and activities on transnational feminism, along with the multiple discourse of postmodern feminism that can analyze the notion and attempt to promote the gender equality in our society. However, we have arranged some different webinars on 2020 and 2021 from the Women's Forum of our college, in which one writer Joya Mitro from the West Bengal and Professor Umme Farhana from East Bengal or Bangladesh have presented their views of feminism in regards to the modern feminist literature, and from the viewpoint of philosophical outlook with much more broader spectrum. We are now waiting here to discuss on feminism today. So once again, I welcome Dr. Banerjee to deliver her lecture. At the same time, I must pay my hearty congratulations to the HOD, Department of Philosophy, Kiriki College, Dr. Prabhavati Das Mollik, Associate Professor, Department of Philosophy, and the theme note presenter of today, as well as the convener of the seminar subcommittee, Dr. Tonika Bhattacharya, Associate Professor, Department of Philosophy, Kiriki College. Dr. Bhattacharya's initiatives for organizing the webinars in all aspects are really remarkable, no doubt. I pay my hearty congratulations to Dr. Shati Pal, our IQAC and ICC coordinator, whose presence is very much important for this webinar, like other webinars. At the same time, I want to pay my thanks to the heads and faculties of each department, along with other viewers and listeners of this live telecast. I want to pay my thanks to the distinguished scholars, critics, and our YouTube channel subscribers, and to the students of Kiriki College who have assembled here. No doubt they are very precious part of our college. So be ready to get inspired by a fantastic session ahead. Thank you all once again. Over to you. Over to the conductor. Thank you.
Sir, for your absolutely relevant address for today's webinar. Now, I'd like to request our head of the department, Dr. Prabhavati Das Malik, to give her introductory address for today's webinar as the head of the Department of Philosophy. Over to you, Prabha. Yes, Prabha.
হ্যালো, শোনা যাচ্ছে?
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ শোনা যাচ্ছে। Yes.
শোনা যাচ্ছে?
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ শুনতে পাচ্ছি, শুনতে
আচ্ছা
পাচ্ছি।
আচ্ছা, ঠিক আছে সরি।
No, 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 it's okay. It's absolutely fine. Just you go ahead
থ্যাংক
with
ইউ।
your speech.
Good evening to one and all present here. Respected Principal Sir, Khidipur College, Dr. Abhijit Ganguly, IQAC Coordinator, Dr. Swati Pal, Honorable Speaker, Dr. Amrita Banerjee, distinguished guests, my fellow colleagues, and my dear students. On behalf of the Department of Philosophy, Khidipur College, I offer my regards to all of you. Today, we are honored to have with us Dr. Amrita Banerjee, Associate Professor of Philosophy, Department of Humanities and Social Science, IIT Bombay, as our key speaker who will speak on care ethics in the perspective of transnational feminism. This topic is not only a very relevant one from the perspective of philosophy, but also pragmatically, it is an important issue for UG and PG students of philosophy as well as other disciplines. The phrase care ethics has its roots in feminist theory and was originally coined by psychologist Carol Gilligan. The phrase was created after a study that was conducted on how little girls look at ethics. Gilligan found that in relation to boys, the moral development of girls tended to come from compassion instead of being justice based. From the study, Gilligan proposed that ethics should be focused on relationships instead of emphasizing autonomy and rules. Her theory focused more on our connections with each other and situations being context dependent. Another American philosopher, Neil Noddings, further contributed to the theory in the 1980s. Noddings decided to focus the approach more on our intimate relationships. She felt that it was necessary to differentiate between natural caring or wanting to care and ethical caring or needing to care. Thus, ethics of care perspective stands in stark contrast to ethical theories that rely on principles to highlight moral actions such as Kantian deontology, utilitarianism, and justice theory. Neil Noddings provided uh, one of the first comprehensive theories of care and argued that caring is the foundation of morality. She saw relationships as ontologically basic to humanity, where identity is defined by the set of relationships individuals have with other humans. In suggesting that caring is a universal human attribute, Noddings asserted that a caring relation is ethically basic to humans. Since the impulse to care is universal, caring ethics is freed from the charge of moral relativism. With this, I ask our today's coordinator, Professor Tonika Bhattacharya, to invite formally Dr. Banerjee to begin her talk. Thank you. Over to Tonika.
Thank you, our head of the department, Prabha. Um, Now, before inviting our honored guest speaker, uh, I'd like to say a few words um, the today's about today's theme, as well as about our honorary speaker, Dr. Ramrita Banerjee. First, a few words about the speaker. She's a very, very talented and young philosopher of our present times, and she's the associate professor of philosophy at the Department of Humanities and Social Science, Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay. A few words about her works in different globally. She received her PhD in philosophy and the graduate certificate in women and gender studies from the University of Oregon, USA. With an enviable academic record, she her undergraduate education was from Presidency College, Department of Philosophy, post graduation from Jadavpur University, Department of Philosophy. She was also the assistant professor of philosophy at Allegheny College, Pennsylvania, USA, prior to joining IIT Bombay. Now, about her specialization, she specializes in moral and socio-political philosophy, uh, which she approaches from different perspectives, such as the perspectives of feminist philosophy, classical pragmatism, 20th century continental philosophy, and so on. Her papers have appeared in prestigious journals such as Hypatia, the Journal of Speculative Philosophy, the Pluralist and Philosophy in the Contemporary World. Banerjee is the co-editor of the special issue of philosophy in the contemporary world titled Mothering from the Margins. Now, Dr. Banerjee's talk today will be on one of the very, very important theoretical concerns of today. Uh, the concerns of feminist ethics and the contributions of this particular field on the Western feminist arena, and that is the ethics of care. A very, very contemporary topic indeed. And this topic can be addressed not only from the perspective of philosophy, but also from the perspective of feminist history, from the perspective of social science, such as international relations, gender studies, as well as from the perspective of literature. So, we are looking forward to hear Dr. Banerjee on this specific topic, and we all know that she has made a major contribution on this field, and her work on care ethics is widely acclaimed. So, with this brief introduction on Dr. Banerjee and about his area, I'd like to request Dr. Banerjee to take the center stage and start her talk. Thank you so much.
Good evening, everyone. First of all, I thank Khidirpur College, Department of Philosophy, for inviting me today, and special thanks to Professor Tonika Bhattacharya. So today, my topic of presentation is care ethics, as Professor Bhattacharya has already mentioned. Now, just to give you some context, my work in care ethics has involved various facets of it. One has been in the context of thinking of normative social policy through the lens of care ethics. But also, I have been working quite a bit in, while I'm very sort of invested in the care tradition, I'm also I think there are interventions needed from the post-colonial and transnational perspective, feminist perspectives in this tradition. Care ethics, as you know, historically has been It's one of the young traditions of moral and socio-political philosophy in the context of feminist philosophy. However, both its genealogies and its development has remained quite Western and white stream. Uh, uh, so, so my work actually revolves around problematizing some of these genealogies as well as developing the care tradition from the lens of post-colonial feminism and transnational feminism, as well as indigenous philosophies. So, with that context in mind, I will present today's talk, which is titled The Philosophical Quandaries of Care Ethics for Transnational Feminism. This talk is actually based on a paper that has come out in a volume called Feminist and Queer Theory, an Intersectional and Transnational Reader. This has been edited by L. Ayu Saraswati and Barbara Shaw and has come out from Oxford University Press, USA. And my paper there is titled A Transnational Intervention into an Ethic of Care. So today's talk is based on some of the themes I have inaugurated there, but also developments on it. Now, an ethic of care is one of the key theoretical contributions by feminist philosophers in recent times to the domains of both feminist theory and philosophical theory. This tradition introduces devastating critiques against some dominant moral and political traditions, especially what it designates as justice-based ethics. And this includes various dominant traditions that we typically study in philosophy, such as Kantian deontology, social contract theory, and so on. Reflecting on practices of care, and while understanding the historical confinement of care work to the domain of the feminine and its role in women's oppression, the philosophical tradition of care ethics has very innovatively subverted this concept of care to produce a sophisticated feminist theoretical frame. Care is evolved into a philosophical concept which is both moral and political, and also has implications for policy formulations from a feminist angle. Care as a moral concept helps us to think about how we ought to relate to others. As a political concept, it helps us to think about the state's responsibility towards its citizens and to develop new ethical foundations for public policies involving vulnerable groups. Recently, attempts have been made to apply care ethics to transnational feminist issues, such as the global movement of women caregivers, from developing nations to affluent nations to fill the care deficit in affluent nations. So, for instance, Kitte's work in this respect, global peacekeeping and the use of military humanitarian interventions in situations of conflict by Toronto, and transnational commercial surrogacy, for instance, by Parks in the context of transnational surrogacy. Now, while acknowledging the revolutionary potential of an ethic of care for feminist theory, I argue that we must exercise caution in extrapolating it to a transnational sphere. Various conceptual resources within the tradition, such as responsibility and relationality, which constitute its center of gravity, can become double-edged swords within a transnational space. As applications or extrapolations are attempted, therefore, we need to philosophically interrogate the decolonizing potential of an ethic of care. And this is a topic on which I have been working, and this talk can be situated within this context. Now, note that the aim of my analysis is not to dismiss the importance of the care paradigm for a global feminist ethics, not to simply substitute it with the justice-based paradigms like the contract paradigm. Neither do I intend to debate the antagonism or complementarity between the two, which much of recent feminist philosophical literature has focused on. Rather, my aim is to propose what I call a transnational intervention into an ethic of care. In this, I call for a reversal in theoretical methodology at the level of theory building of an ethic of care. The reversal involves putting central concepts from an ethic of care in conversation with conceptual resources from transnational feminisms, such as the ideas of third world difference and normative referent offered by Chandra Mohanty, or the concept of first world privilege, which I have developed in my prior work on transnational surrogacy and the idea of race in previous papers. Through my analysis, I intend to drive home the fact that we cannot take the transnational sphere as a passive domain for the application and extrapolation of what might be considered to be an otherwise complete theory. In fact, the conceptual quandaries outlined in this talk today must not be treated as a post facto problem of application of an otherwise complete ethical paradigm to a global context. Rather, the theory must be modified to accommodate specific challenges from the point of view of transnational feminisms. And I think the important point is that transnational feminisms can expose points of conceptual discomfort and incompleteness in the care paradigm. The reversal, in the form of a transnational intervention into the ethic of care proposed, provides, therefore, care ethics with a critical opportunity to reflect on itself, understand some points of its incompleteness, and design conceptual anchors in ways that can facilitate more rigorous applications, extrapolations, and collaborations with transnational feminist theory and practice. The talk today is divided into two sections. In section one, I define relationality and responsibility, since these are among key concepts that the care model sees itself as contributing to transnational debates. I define these after examining care ethics' dislodging of the liberal concept of reciprocity and the contract paradigm, the social contract paradigm, as primary modes of conceiving ideal moral political relations. In section 2, I argue that the decentering of reciprocity inaugurates several conceptual quandaries for transnational feminisms. It might also lead to a colonizing notion of responsibility, despite the motivations of care ethicists to the contrary. I conclude that it would be important to retain substantial moral weight for reciprocity, although it must now learn to account for various asymmetries. With this in mind, now I would like to get into section 1, which is titled Relationality, Responsibility, and Critique of the Liberal Notion of Reciprocity. Care ethics first arises as a critical feminist reaction to certain dominantly masculinist philosophical theories on ethics and justice, such as the social contract theory, articulated by famous philosophers as Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Kant, and more recently, Rawls. In fact, the modern liberal conception of reciprocity is intimately tied to the idea of a contract. A contract is an agreement between autonomous and freely consenting individuals who are the parties to it. The idea of a contract is taken to be a conceptual blueprint for free and just social and political relations, such as the relation among citizens. So, for instance, thinking about what they owe to each other, as well as between a citizen and the state. The social contract is often taken to be governed by a more fundamental moral contract, which considers all human beings to have equal worth and as having some basic moral obligation towards each other. The contract model values individual autonomy and independence, since a contract is not possible without the consent of those, that is, the parties it governs. Care ethics offers a strong critique of the contract paradigm and the associated liberal conception of reciprocity. I believe that a holistic way to understand care ethics' emphasis on concepts such as relationality and responsibility is to read these alongside the larger critique of reciprocity and contractuality offered by the care tradition. My analysis in this section situates the reading of responsibility and relationality within this larger rejection of contractuality. Now, one of the most sophisticated critiques of the contract paradigm coming out of care ethics is by Eva Kitte in her book Love's Labor, and it is well known as the Dependency Critique. And here, Kitte's critique is primarily directed to Rawls's version of the social contract and the understanding of reciprocity. In Rawls's philosophy, the socio-political sphere is conceived as a sphere of cooperative activity in which individual citizens, in their capacity as self-interested agents, compete for certain primary goods. These goods are primary as they are desirable to all human beings and include things such as rights and liberties, health, income, and the social basis of self respect. The main concern from the point of view of justice in this contract paradigm is to stipulate terms of fair cooperation so that every individual, as a party to the terms of cooperation, shares equally in its benefits and burdens. In this context, equality and reciprocity as fundamental values become important. Citing Rawls's perspective on equality, Kitte writes, and I quote her here, the representation for equality is an easy matter. We simply describe all the parties in the same way and situate them equally, that is, symmetrically with respect to one another. Unquote. This is Kitte talking about Rawls's understanding of Rawls's perspective. In the Rawlsian scheme, symmetry between the parties becomes a defining feature of equality since each party is taken to be situated equally in relation to other parties. When equality is defined as symmetry, and this is important, then it entails reciprocity. That is, each party shares in the benefits and burdens of social cooperation according to a common benchmark of comparison. No individual in the contract paradigm is typically morally entitled to more or less benefits or burdens based on, for instance, the social location she inhabits at the time. Kitte again cites Rawls's understanding of it as follows, quote, they must each benefit or share in common burdens in some appropriate fashion judged by a suitable benchmark of comparison, unquote. Kitte's dependency critique is famous because it displaces the traditional liberal model of reciprocity among equals as models of cooperative activity, which sediments in the idea of a social contract, actually. Rather than viewing the socio-political sphere as one of competition among independent and self-interested agents, it conceives of it as a network of relations. Kitte observes, quote, a conception of society viewed as an association of equals masks inequitable dependencies, those of infancy and childhood, old age, illness, and disability. While we are dependent, we are not well positioned to enter a competition for the goods of social cooperation on equal terms, unquote. Through her critique, Kitte emphasizes the sorts of relationships that are forms of dependencies and cannot be captured by the language of independence and equality. Disregarding dependencies, along with the material vulnerabilities and asymmetries involved, allows us to pretend autonomy for moral and socio-political agents. This model, therefore, is problematic for women and other vulnerable groups, according to care ethicists. Consequently, argues Kitte, the model of equality-based reciprocity offered by the liberal moral and political tradition is a flawed center of moral gravity and is inadequate for conceiving of a just socio-political order. Through her dependency critique, Kitte foregrounds the material inequalities and asymmetries in capabilities, power, etc., that characterize various dependencies. She argues that disregarding these kinds of dependencies, along with the inequalities and asymmetries involved, allows us to pretend independence and define interdependence as, quote, the mutual, often voluntary cooperation between essentially independent persons, unquote. Instead of starting out with the relation between equals and reciprocity as the basis for the moral ought, she therefore urges us to look at these non reciprocal and hence non contractual relationships, such as those between a care receiver and a caregiver, as the primary site of moral meaning and a basis for grounding justice related concerns or claims. This means that the center of moral gravity must be shifted towards non contractual relationships, which by implication are non reciprocal in the sense I have defined so far, such as those between a care receiver and caregiver. Since mothering was taken to be a paradigmatic case of caring, the infant parent relations served as a powerful image in some works, especially the earlier formulations of care ethics like in Noddings, although in more recent works such as by Held, Toronto, or Kite, this tends to be substituted by more neutral terms such as caregiver or dependency worker and care receiver or dependent. The general ethos, however, remains the same insofar it recognizes vulnerability and the lack of reciprocity between the cared for and caregiver in terms of capabilities, resources, and so on. In the cases of certain dependencies, as in the case of infancy or severe disabilities, the care receiver might be dependent on the caregiver even for the satisfaction of her basic needs. The caregiver, in turn, cannot function, and this is a very important point that Kite makes, the caregiver cannot function as a self-interested agent, and she cannot compete for basic goods according to a common benchmark of comparison with those that are unencumbered by such caring responsibilities. Since one's personal autonomy and independence is fundamentally affected by another in an act of care, conceptual priorities accorded to security and well-being rather than liberty and independence in the care model. And by the way, this sort of the focus, the aim of or the moral goal or the political goal of well-being and security as opposed to liberty and independence is actually a fundamental point of distinction between care ethics and the liberal paradigm. The shift of focus to non-contractual relations on the caregiver-care receiver model means that the thrust of the model is towards attending to the needs of someone for whom another person takes responsibility. This becomes the paradigmatic way of conceiving moral and political relations. The concept of responsibility offered by care ethics highlights other-orientedness, since the caregiver's primary energies are directed towards the care receiver, the relatedness between the two, the unequal vulnerabilities on different sides of the relation, and finally, an acceptance of some kind of burden on the part of the caregiver. Toronto speaks about some of these aspects in her book, Moral Boundaries. Virginia Held also attempts to clearly delineate the major theoretical contributions of an ethic of care in her book called The Ethics of Care. The basic conceptual commitments include emphasizing an ontology of dependence and interdependence, or in a word, relations as opposed to the self-sufficient individualism of traditional liberal moral philosophy, the moral salience of attending to and meeting the needs of particular others for whom we take responsibility, the deficiency of relying on reason alone in the moral domain, and consequently the importance of emotions to moral inquiry, skepticism about abstraction and reliance on universal moral laws, and the need to situate non-contractual relations at the heart of moral and socio-political philosophy. Care is conceived as both value and practice and goes on to form a moral basis for interpersonal ethics, public ethics, and a global ethics. We Are All Some Mother's Child is taken to be a model of moral and political theory. The emphasis on relationality and the shift of moral gravity to non-contractual modes of relating then sediments into the idea of responsibility as opposed to obligation, which justice-based ethics functions with, as the primary way of conceiving one's moral comportment towards the other. This non-contractual moral and socio-political ontology is committed to attending to the needs of the other and protecting the vulnerable. Marking the shift from a dry principle of obligation to that of responsibility, Toronto observes, quote, "We are better served by focusing on a flexible notion of responsibility than we are by continuing to use obligation as the basis for understanding what people should do for each other," unquote. Along with responsibility, Toronto in particular talks about responsiveness. Responsiveness as an aspect of care, argues Toronto, helps maintain a balance between the needs of caregivers and care receivers. Since it demands attentiveness, it requires one to be alert to the possibilities of abuse in vulnerable situations. At the same time, however, Toronto sort of keeps a clear distinction between responsiveness and reciprocity. These are crucial points which I would like to highlight before we take up care in the context of global feminist ethics. A feminist ethic of care can serve as a powerful resource for feminist theory since it marks off certain distinct philosophical resources for feminism. A global feminist ethics and transnational feminisms of any variety face a set of unique challenges. Cycles of dependencies accentuated by globalization come hand in hand with concerns over unequal distribution, unequal access to resources, etc., that pose a real challenge to liberatory projects all over the world, including feminist ones. Other orientedness, relationality, and taking responsibility can be very important tools for theorizing transnational relations, multiple oppressions, and for identifying what we can do for one another on the basis of these relations. This is partly due to the fact, as Toronto rightly observes, quote, caring requires that one start from the standpoint of the one needing care or attention. It requires that we meet the other morally, adopt that person's or group's perspective, and look at the world in those terms. Caring becomes a way to monitor and perhaps to check the bad faith that might otherwise creep into the activities of feminist theorists, unquote. Lack of trust and bad faith between feminists is a real danger in conversations and collaborations across differences, for example, across racial, cultural, linguistic, religious, and national borders, which transnational feminisms, in fact, draw our attention to and has to constantly grapple with. The refusal to take another group or alternative feminist agendas seriously, dismissing a group's viewpoint simply because it is different from one's own, and uncritically imposes one group's views and judgments on another are explicit exercises in bad faith. Here, care ethics can become a valuable resource, since care ethics asks us to morally start from the perspective of the other rather than the self, and try to understand the world from the other's perspective. New basis of good faith and trustworthiness can be established, argues Toronto. By putting these demands on us, the care paradigm urges us to learn by borrowing from each other's experiences. This is something that Toronto talks about. Even when the parties involved are not in a relationship of reciprocal exchange. To quote her, trustworthiness requires that, quote, feminist theorists surrender as much as they gain by borrowing from the experience of others, unquote, and the philosophical concept of care allows for precisely this. However, I think a larger challenge, and one that Toronto does not deal with, is clarifying what is meant by borrowing from each other's experiences and what such an exercise would consist of in the transnational sphere, given the fact that differential experiences across inequalities, such as across the first world, third world divide, which are regular features of such transnational relations, create fundamental incommensurabilities in both experiences and knowledges. I will shed more light on this concern in the next section through the discussion of the differential and, in fact, oppositional experiences of colonization between the colonizer and the colonized. Care ethicists do recognize that there is a possibility of physical and emotional abuse in vulnerable situations where the vulnerability of the care receiver is exploited by the caregiver for their self-interest. Abuse in hospitals and caregiving facilities for the elderly are examples that immediately come to mind. Therefore, it is not the case that all instances of care necessarily constitute an ethic of care, as Held puts it. And this is an important point. For such an ethic to obtain, caring must be self-reflective, they argue, and must be subjected to evaluation. These demands sediment, for instance, in Toronto's stipulation of responsiveness and competence as aspects of care, whereby the caregiver is called to be attentive, develop trust, think from the standpoint of those she's caring for, and to carry out caring democratically. I would like to emphasize, however, that Toronto maintains a clear distinction between concepts of responsiveness in the sense of attending to the needs of others and reciprocity in the sense of the voluntary relation between equal and autonomous agents. This distinction, in turn, helps to uphold the contrast between the care paradigm and the contract paradigm. While recognizing the importance of all these points, I now argue that decentering reciprocity, or to put it otherwise, centering relationality and responsibility at the expense of reciprocity, poses unique problems from the perspective of transnational feminisms. I will now move on to section 2, which is titled Quandaries of an Ethic of Care for Transnational Feminisms. Now, I must note that I share the care ethicist concerns with the liberal conception of reciprocity as the conscious relation between autonomous and equal individuals, since such a definition may cover over actual vulnerabilities. Social causes of vulnerability include oppression due to one's membership in a marginalized group and various structural inequalities, which create real obstacles to equality for individuals from marginalized groups relative to their more privileged peers. Due to the implied, or rather assumed, connection of the traditional notion of reciprocity with equality, as Kite has pointed out, and moreover, equality's definition in terms of symmetry and commensurability that I've explained, fundamental inequalities, asymmetries, and vulnerabilities of the kind mentioned across differences may get covered over. The other orientedness of care ethics, along with the importance on relationality and vulnerability, can be significant resources for transnational feminisms. Also, I agree that it is very important to open up adequate theoretical space for relationality and vulnerability in moral and political philosophy, broadly speaking. I am, however, apprehensive of making the caregiver care receiver model the primary mode for conceiving moral responsibility and for grounding claims of justice in the transnational sphere. Acknowledging the lack of reciprocity in relations is one thing, but shifting the center of moral gravity away from it is another. And it is this problem with the latter that I now turn to in the context of feminist relations, specifically across the first world, third world divide. Although this point can apply to feminist relations, thinking about moral and political relations of between feminists across other divides as well. My main concern pertains to a basic inequality. Henceforth, I refer to it as paradigm-induced asymmetry, which I think is built into the formal structure of the care paradigm, irrespective of its material content. That is, irrespective of its application to any particular context of analysis. To explain this, let's try to understand what the simplest elements of the care model are. If we look at the form, the basic structure of the care model, we find that it contains three elements. These are the caregiver, let's signify this element as X, the care receiver, let's signify this element as Y, and the relation between them, let's call this R. X, Y, and R are the formal constituents of the model. Let's not consider for the time being who in real life is actually stepping into the shoes of X and Y and what their group membership or social position is. Not considering these material aspects, we notice, and just focusing on the formal structure of the care model for now, we notice that X and the role it signifies by definition is unequal to Y and the role it signifies, since X and Y are asymmetric with respect to R. Asymmetry is a feature of R because it encapsulates various inequalities, incapabilities, vulnerabilities, and power obtaining between X, that is the giver, and Y, that is the receiver. Since asymmetry becomes a feature of R, it becomes a formal feature of the care paradigm. Therefore, I characterize this basic asymmetry as paradigm induced, that is pertaining to the form of the care model. From this kind of formal asymmetry, let us distinguish now material asymmetries, that is, various inequalities on the ground. Let's consider a particular instance of caring where Sally has to step into the role of X, that is the giver, and Molly steps into the role of Y, receiver. And where Sally occupies a privileged position in the social hierarchy, where she is privileged with respect to race, ability, and citizenship status compared to Molly. Here again, we find that Sally and Molly are asymmetric with relation to R, that is the relation. The asymmetry in this case, however, is different from the former one because it encapsulates various social inequalities and hierarchy in social status between Sally and Molly, even before and irrespective of whether they step into the roles of X and Y respectively. Since these inequalities pertain to the social status of X and Y, let us call these status-induced asymmetries and distinguish such status-induced asymmetries from the paradigm-induced asymmetry previously mentioned. From the point of view of transnational feminisms, I argue that the two kinds of asymmetries, and this is my basic argument, that the two kinds of asymmetries will further aggravate each other in the context of transnational relations. This paves the way for a colonizing conception of responsibility to emerge within the care model, despite the impetus of care ethics to the contrary. The discussion in this section is meant to highlight the dangers of decentering reciprocity and of dismissing the normative import of contractuality altogether for transnational feminisms. My analysis takes inspiration from some important critiques of hegemonic Western feminisms by transnational feminists. Often, the understanding of women from developing nations on the part of a number of Western feminists is mediated by what Chandra Mohanty calls third world difference, which can only be grasped in view of the domination of the world system by the West. According to Mohanty, while the category of oppressed woman emerges in the context of gender difference, the oppressed third world woman has the additional attribute of third world difference. Since third world women are perceived through third world difference, they are treated as immature and as lacking agency. They lack in all those abilities and values which characterize the powerful and liberated first world woman. Third world difference as a conceptual category entails and, in fact, works hand in hand with its complement, namely first world privilege, which I've spoken about, as I said, in my work on race and transnational surrogacy. First world privilege intersects with prevailing hierarchies of race, caste, etc., to give new life to various structural inequalities across the first world third world divide and justifies the unequal distribution of benefits and burdens across this divide. Both third world difference and first world privilege can be categorized as status induced asymmetries, as I have defined in the context of today's talk, since these are tied to actual social locations which are generated by global inequalities and stratification. Such status based asymmetries underlie and are constantly enacted in transnational feminist conversations. For example, when first world feminists see themselves as liberating their third world sisters. I would like to develop the concept of status induced asymmetry further by engaging with Mohanty's concept of the normative referent. Mohanty writes, quote, "The distinction between Western feminist representation of women in the third world and Western feminist self-presentation are made on the basis of the privileging of a particular group as the norm or referent," unquote. Here, we are not simply referring to differences in experiences between groups of women, but rather we are creating two mutually exclusive categories, or a binary analytic, as Mohanty calls it, namely third world women versus first world women, where one is the norm and the other is a deviation from the norm. Such referencing in the light of a norm, right? So here referencing is not innocent, it's happening in the light of a norm, creates hierarchies and paves the way for objectifying the category which is treated as deviant. Note that an unequal structural relation is already anchored in a deeper idea of the normative referent, which interestingly can not only be taken to be an outcome of inequality on the global stage, but actually upholds the cycle of which it is a product. I think that the most powerful impact of the idea of the normative referent is that it performs the ideological role of rendering the third world woman as inessential, that is, an object rather than an agent or an active subject. As an antonym, that is, an opposite to the normative referent, the third world woman is automatically put on a non-reciprocal relation to the first world woman. This is what I term as the threat of non-reciprocal objectification, which very easily becomes a fundamental tool for perpetuating oppression. Third world women, by virtue of their status, are deprived of agency and become passive victims, whom first world women, again by virtue of their status, must enlighten and care for. However, the actual narratives of agency on the part of third world women remain much more complex than this kind of objectification allows for. The point I want to emphasize is that various status induced asymmetries provide the typical backdrop against which the paradigm-induced asymmetry of an ethic of care must grapple with in order for care to operationalize in a transnational space. My worry is that existing status based asymmetries, such as third world difference or first world privilege, which already produce exploitative relations between first world and third world feminists, will be accentuated further and, in fact, can now find a conceptual justification for themselves in light of the paradigm induced asymmetry and the overall turn away from reciprocity and contractuality. The paradigm induced asymmetry ends up placing agency too heavily on the caregiver's X's end of the relation compared to the care receiver Y. This means that the kind of power that X yields in relation to Y is immense and sometimes may even be considered to be in Y's best interest. For example, in case of an infant's relation to their parent. In transnational space, however, which is already rendered complex by various status-induced asymmetries, such an unbalanced account of agency threatens to greatly multiply already existing vulnerabilities and exploitative relations on the ground. This threat increases exponentially when members of privileged groups see themselves as caring for others that they consider to be less fortunate than them. This also creates a strong foundation for a colonizing conception of responsibility to emerge, which was precisely the case in the context of interactions between women across the colonizer colonized divide. In other words, in moments of non reciprocal objectification, both kinds of asymmetries that I have mentioned today, can sediment further into what may be termed as status induced non reciprocity. So, paradigm induced asymmetry and status induced asymmetry can generate a kind of status induced non reciprocity, whereby the parties on two ends of the relations come with or are perceived as coming with unequal bargaining powers to the table. They are now deprived of the normative protections of equality and reciprocity, which are held up by the contractual model of moral and socio-political relations. The foreclosing of the possibility to be taken as equal means that conceptually a power imbalance gets tacitly embedded in the very structure of care, thereby greatly obstructing any narrative of mutual autonomy that some care ethicists consider to be upheld by care. Status induced non reciprocities result in various colonizing agendas in the context of practices of care. For instance, as Mohanty notes, images defining third world women in the Western feminist imaginary, such as the veiled woman, the obedient woman, etc., to quote her, exist in universal ahistorical splendor, setting in motion a colonialist discourse that exercises a very specific power in defining, coding, and maintaining existing first and third world connections, unquote. Status induced non reciprocity, as I have called it, very quickly solidifies into institutional structures, such as in designing platforms for feminist cross cultural exchanges, resolving leadership issues, and identifying stakeholders for specific feminist debates, identifying issues as important versus unimportant, and even dismissing versus accepting specific agendas as feminist to begin with. It reminds us that a lot turns on who characterizes a situation as being non reciprocal, for what purposes, and so on. These concerns become especially important when we are reflecting on ethical praxis between groups that are differentially situated in terms of resources, needs, interests, etc., in global relations, which for the most part are already skewed in favor of particular groups and against others. All these together produce a colonizing account of responsibility. This also highlights ways in which the paradigm induced asymmetry is potentially heightened and can easily take a colonizing turn in interaction with status induced asymmetries. Of course, care ethicists themselves want to de emphasize this asymmetry in the long run by calling for judging or evaluating practices of care such that mutual autonomy between two parties can be enacted. However, my point is precisely that paradigm induced asymmetry, with its implicit shift to non reciprocity as a center of moral gravity, will obstruct the unfolding of narratives of mutual autonomy for transnational feminisms when it finds itself grappling with various status based asymmetries. A short essay by Uma Narayan on care and justice in the context of empire building, colonization, and slavery provides much food for thought in delineating the colonizing potential of responsibility. Narayan draws our attention to the presence of such a colonialist care discourse, which historically anchored and conceptually justified projects of colonization and slavery. She, in fact, also points to some problematic resonances between the historical colonial care discourses and some contemporary strands of an ethic of care. For the purposes of her argument, she focuses attention on who defines the contested terms, that is, care. She also highlights the close collaboration between the colonial rights discourse and care discourse, which is very interesting because care ethicists actually try to distance themselves from the rights language. But Narayan shows that sometimes both of these paradigms have actually served colonial agendas. Okay. Writes Narayan, quote, justifications for colonialism and slavery in terms of crude self-interest seem to have been rare. These enterprises were made morally palatable by the rhetoric of responsibility and care for enslaved and colonized others, unquote. The discourse had a normative power. It not only helped to make colonial domination morally palatable, but here we then see the ethical conviction to care translating into public policy and obscuring global relations of power and domination. The final important point that Narayan's analysis makes is that while an ethic of care emphasizes the need to attend to the particular other, a care discourse operationalized in the colonial context ironically played the opposite role. That is, it became a mechanism for subjugating entire groups of people to others. I think the last point highlights specific problems with the underlying structure, epistemology, and ontology of an ethic of care. In the terms I'm developing, this serves as a powerful example of what might happen when paradigm-induced asymmetry combines with status-induced asymmetries to generate further inequalities on the ground. Without building a robust discourse of group relations, group hierarchies, and group embeddedness into the moral and socio-political ontology of care, and without analyzing or critiquing the impact of the specific epistemic positions held in place by these, an ethic of care will always come dangerously close to degenerating into a colonizing moral vision of the kind that Narayan critiques. Although Narayan herself primarily understands the problem in terms of paternalism mixed with economic concerns, my emphasis is on the paradigm-induced and status-induced asymmetries, which uphold various status-induced non-reciprocities in their stead. One of the key contributions of care ethics is the idea of relationality, which also recognizes vulnerability as an aspect of the human condition. I believe, however, that the conceptual potential of these must be rethought as we place them alongside a concept such as the normative referent by Mohanty that I've just talked about. Let me develop this point by bringing it to bear on Narayan's reference to historical colonization, although Narayan herself does not frame her analysis in these terms. The overwhelming success of the care discourse in the context of colonialism lay in the fact that relations between the parties is recognized, but then its violent potential is exploited when differences are defined in self-serving ways by the dominant and powerful, according to Narayan. While vulnerability is unequally distributed in the relation, this differential vulnerability in turn is exploited to create new toxic vulnerabilities for the most vulnerable. I believe that this is because relationality, that is the colonizer-colonized relation in this case that we are discussing through Narayan, and the power imbalances between them is already vitiated by normative referencing on the part of the dominant group. The threats of both symbolic and structural violence always loom large along with and at the expense of relationality. In the light of the refined discussion through accompanying paradigm-induced and status-induced asymmetries. No wonder Narayan observes that it has always been the case that, quote, the colonizers and the colonized, while both acutely conscious of their relationship to each other, had very different accounts of what the relationship and its interdependencies amounted to and whether they were morally justified, unquote. Moreover, assumptions about epistemological and moral superiorities or inferiority are typically embedded in such referencing processes, apart from the normative aspect of it. and threaten to impact key epistemic questions that arises for care ethics, such as the translation and interpretation of needs within which an act of caring sees itself as being directed at. In order to address this predicament, some care ethicists say that there is a need to be aware, attentive, and listen to the other. The point I'm making, however, is that various status induced asymmetries in any given act of caring and the differential experiences of the same act of care by parties on different sides of the norm, for example, the colonizer versus the colonized, creates tremendous problems for the epistemological project of understanding, speaking, and hearing. This larger structural context and care being already entrenched in it makes it vastly difficult for care to evaluate and correct itself in self-referential terms, that is purely with reference to the internal values of the care paradigm. So this is so I think that the fact that care ethicists see that there will be a self-corrected that the standards for self-correction are within the care paradigm itself, and this is what I think is actually a mistake. Lack of awareness about the relation, associated vulnerabilities, and inequalities of the transnational order is not the problem here. Rather, it is the opposite. An acute awareness of unequal relation and further exploitation on the basis of this recognition is what complicates matters on the decolonization front. A transnational intervention into an ethic of care, I think, therefore, provides valuable insight on points of incompleteness within the care paradigm, which it must address if it is to speak productively to transnational feminisms as well as ground claims of transnational ethics and justice. The most significant problem is that of paradigm induced asymmetry, which takes on an especially dangerous turn as it materializes within various status induced asymmetries. Status induced asymmetries threaten to be further aggravated in the light of paradigm induced asymmetry and conversely. The concern here is about the colonizing potential of care ethics, or at least its failure to decolonize by default. This is different from a concern about simple paternalism, although the two are connected. And just to clarify, I think that while paternalism primarily focuses on individual attitudes and motives, my engagement with care ethics from the lens of transnational feminism retains focus on group positions. For example, the kind of social and economic relations among the colonizer and colonized, institutional constraints and structures, even as it accommodates concerns about paternalism. So what I'm speaking to is not simply the problem being that of paternalism, but actually much more and being structural at a very basic level. Categories such as status-induced asymmetries, status-induced non-reciprocities are meant to bring back attention to this point and complicate the problem as moving well beyond paternalism. At the end of the day, to wrap up, my worry with turning moral attention away from reciprocity is threefold. First, it does not take long for status-induced asymmetries to transform into status-induced non-reciprocities in the context of non-reciprocal objectification, as I have explained. If the notion of reciprocity were completely stripped of moral force, it would be easy to reify existing material inequalities into abiding non-reciprocities through processes such as normative referencing. Second, it does not take long for the reified non-reciprocities to translate into assumptions about epistemological and moral hierarchies across group differences. After all, whatever or whoever is considered inessential lies at the periphery of the norm and can be subjected to various forms of epistemological and moral colonialisms. These, in turn, bar members of oppressed groups from being treated as equals. Moreover, the interpretive possibilities and translations of needs that must be met, and subsequent evaluations or judgments about whether these have been met, or the aspect of responsiveness that Toronto insists on, are already embedded in a space that is no doubt cosmopolitan but also compromised at the same time. This makes me doubt the sufficiency of the internal values of the care paradigm to mitigate bad faith and build trust across group hierarchies. Third, we have an uncomfortable dilemma. The relationship between groups occupying different positions is not reciprocal in a fundamental sense. Since it is often characterized by vast inequalities and power differentials that can make one far more dependent on the other, at least materially. This is captured through the concept of status induced asymmetry offered in this talk. My analysis, however, has highlighted ways in which these asymmetries can interact dangerously with the paradigm induced asymmetry of an ethic of care to perpetuate various status induced non reciprocities in their stead. Against this backdrop, a turn away from reciprocity and an excessive emphasis on non reciprocity can inadvertently end up placing agency and its potential too heavily on one side of the relation. And this is something that really troubles me. After all, the kind of power that a caregiver yields in relation to her charge in an act of care, which is an outcome of the paradigm induced asymmetry, as I've already explained, is often immense, actually desirable, and unwise to question in some cases, like in the case of the infant parent relation. In the transnational sphere that is already rendered complex by geographical, cultural, and economic colonizations, the downplaying of reciprocity could lead to the wrong sorts of relationships, quite contrary to the intent of care ethics. So, in conclusion, the transnational intervention provides insight into various points of incompleteness of the care paradigm, problems that it must conceptually grapple with at the level of theory building, especially as it wants to contribute to transnational feminisms. The most significant one remains the issue of paradigm induced asymmetry, whose dangerous and regressive potential has been highlighted. While the paradigm induced asymmetry might be useful in generating a description of moral and socio political ontologies, whether it constitutes a sufficient basis for the moral ought and justice related theorizing remains the question. I believe so as a, whether it can so although it can function, I think, as a very good descriptive paradigm in the context of transnational relations, whether it is the best in terms of a normative paradigm that is grounding claims of moral ought and claims about justice is my point of contention. I believe that we must critically appraise non reciprocity just as much as we need to critically evaluate the liberal notion of reciprocity following Kitte's dependency critique. Due to the paradigm induced asymmetry, care and its internal values may not suffice as a moral standard and will fail to establish a just cosmopolitan order without guidance from a robust understanding of reciprocity. A transnational intervention reminds us, after all, it is important to reserve substantial moral weight for reciprocity, although it must learn to account for asymmetries as we try to come up with a feminist philosophical model for theorizing moral and socio-political relations across difference. The need of the hour, however, would be to think reciprocity in radically new ways. So with this, I come to an end. In today's talk, I could not really talk about a model of reciprocity that I have developed subsequently, but I just want to refer to another paper in this respect if it is of interest to you. It's called Decolonizing Solidarity and Reciprocity, and it has been published in the New York Routledge volume called The Imbecile's Guide to Public Philosophy. So they're actually, by taking some of the insights of of care ethics, of the care ethics critique of the liberal notion of reciprocity into account, but at the same time also in light of the critique of this critique that I've been developing here, I try to sort of come up with an alternative model of reciprocity which would be better at preserving agency on two sides of the relation. So, so with that, let me end. However, that model again would be probably it would be material for another talk. but just wanted to refer to that paper in case in case you would want to look at the alternative model. So thank you so much, and thank you for your patience. Yeah.
Uh, Thank you, Amrita, as you have delved into very, very interesting as well as lot of questions are, in fact, creeping to our mind regarding your idea of reciprocity. And I have raised 2 or 3 questions after, in fact, before I ask you these questions, I think that it is better to open today's seminar to the other participants so that they can ask you some questions, because there are many areas that, because care ethics is, though it is a very contemporary kind of a development, but there are so, in fact, at least in this part of the in this part of in fact in this here in Bengal, so little are being still yet learned, and in fact so little we know about care ethics. Rather, there are some more and more discussions are needed in this sphere. That's why, though it is very interesting that um, care ethics is being included now in this undergraduate curriculum and all, but still there are a lack of proper material for to teach the students. So there are very, very important and interesting things that you've addressed today. First of all, before I ask you 1 or 2 questions, there are certain questions I think already in the chat box. So I'd like to request Aniket whether you can we say that social Darwinism adopted by the colonized and also Kipling's white man's burden, a status-induced asymmetry?
Rai, thank you for your question. I think uh, these are definitely, one could think about them in terms of status-induced asymmetry, particularly the epistemological aspects of status-induced asymmetry, because it arises. So there's an ontological question about the self in relation to the other, the colonized self, the colonizer self in relation to the colonized, where, for instance, certain aspects of there's been quite interesting work around how white European women often defined themselves as virtuous in relation to native Indian women. Right. So in that context, there's an ontological aspect to it, but there's also this epistemological issue about what we see colonization, the colonizers seeing colonization as this ethical burden, right? In the sense that they are on a civilizing mission. It is about bringing certain progressive values to so-called backward societies. So in that sense, and that is one of my apprehensions, because the acceptance of a moral burden, I think, is quite a unique concept in care ethics that care ethics provides, because it means that one is not simply looking at the other through a certain very dry rationalistic understanding of duty, but is actually looking at the other in terms of certain needs, certain way of responding to them. So that's the virtue uh, of the idea of the moral burden. But my point is that given the paradigm induced asymmetry coupled with the status induced asymmetries that we see in the transnational sphere, and in fact actually any ethics across difference on which my broader work focuses on, this can degenerate into this kind of moral superiority or acceptance of a moral burden, which is very delusional, right? In the sense that that is not how the colonized is actually perceiving the act of colonization. They are not perceiving it as an act of care, whereas the colonizer actually is seeing it as an act of care. And that is where I think Narayan's paper it's a very interesting essay, because it says that, even when it who defines the term care is actually a point of contention, right? Is this a relation of caring? Is it about assuming a moral burden? So I think that these actually, what you have said, can sort of be explained in terms of status induced asymmetry that I have spoken about. Thank you.
Uh,
uh,
this is
yes.
my question rather, because a kind of an uneasiness actually is working at the back of my mind. I know that you have still you are developing on this, but
Mhm.
just because you're working on care ethics for so long, so I couldn't resist in asking you this question. And I have another question also to ask you.
Mhm.
Just let I just want to know your observation on this alternative model of reciprocity.
Okay. As I said, actually, I have already written a paper on this, but I'm also in the course of developing other aspects of it. And that paper is this one called Decolonizing Solidarity and Reciprocity, which is in the volume called The Imbecile's Guide to Public Philosophy by New York Routledge. It has actually come out in 2022. Uh, so there are two things that I addressed. One is this issue of in the contract paradigm, part of the value of the dependency critique that Kite does is to show that, look, there is it entails a kind of reciprocity, but in terms of equality and symmetry between the parties, right? So X and Y are taken to be symmetrical, and they are taken to be equal in respect to each other. And what care ethicists are pointing out is that no, in descriptive terms, in real descriptive terms, most people, if Kite says all of us are either actual or potential dependents, right? So as infants, for instance, we have been dependent. When we get sick or old, we will become dependents again. So every person, the dependency is probably the best possible explanation of the human condition than autonomy. So in that situation, there is this symmetry aspect needs to be really unraveled. Now, on the other hand, what I have pointed out is that, however, given this paradigm and status induced asymmetry, there is a real threat of non reciprocal objectification that can happen, right? And in that context, we do need to factor in things like asymmetry as well as incommensurability. So in the other paper, I also talk about how when we talk about cross-cultural ethics or intergroup communication or feminism across borders, the issue of epistemological and moral incommensurabilities also need to be addressed. And in that context, therefore, we need to think about reciprocity by now factoring in both asymmetry as well as incommensurability. And again, the other aspect is that there is and one of the main contentions points I have raised is that one of the contentions with care ethics is that the agency seems to be that there doesn't seem to be a normative ground for actually holding on to agency on one side of the relation, because in certain cases it may be in the care receiver's interest to be guided by the caregiver, right? So as for instance, when we think about the parent child relation, the child doesn't go for themselves. So it is in that case, it's not just that the parent guides the child, but it seems to be the desirable thing to do, right? The morally desirable thing to do. So, part of what I have done in that model is to actually think about how do we preserve, subjecthood as well as address this question of vulnerability in the
Okay.
context thinking about reciprocity.
Okay. Okay. In
So
fact, okay, go ahead. I do have another question linked with it. Okay, you just go ahead with it, and then I'll ask you.
okay, so just a kind of quick. So of course, it's an elaborate model. It's also kind of based
In
in
fact, I'm
phenomenon.
really looking forward to read your paper when it will be okay.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. So there actually, just I wanted to mention that I look very closely at phenomenology, particularly Beauvoir's understanding of ambiguity, and also women of color feminisms, to then develop an understanding of the self other relation, both in terms of beyond the subject object binary. uh,
Okay.
so so that's the kind of focus of the model. And I say that there's a certain ethics of both recognition but also humility that has to be developed as part of that notion of reciprocity in the context.
In this reciprocity model, we actually are moving with a presupposition. The presupposition is that uh, reciprocity doesn't entail reciprocity entails dependency, or there is a kind of a dependency in reciprocity. Then if it is so, then whether dependency entails domination.
Exactly, and that is I mean, what I want to safeguard the ethical paradigm against is this sort of domination, which is an outcome of, for instance, non-reciprocal
But
objectification.
this is a very slippery area, actually, Amrita. This to
Exactly,
safeguard domination, yet to
exactly,
talk about
exactly,
dependency is a
exactly.
very, very sort of a dangerous zone. Actually, you are, in fact,
Yes,
delving into. So,
exactly, because I think
will you tackle this? How will you, in fact, handle this thing?
so
That
so that actually I have addressed or tried to address to a large extent in that other paper,
okay.
as I develop the model. Because I think, see, the problem has been that moral philosophy, especially the traditional moral theories, contract based moralities, Kantian morality, etc., has taken the actual moral sphere to be very uh, neat and clean and unproblematic, right? So as if the normative claim to reciprocity itself will be necessary and sufficient to ground claims of ground moral claims, is the idea. On the other hand, care ethicists are actually understanding the messiness of actual moral situations, right? Where dependency,
Absolutely.
inequalities of power,
Absolutely.
vulnerabilities are coming into the
Absolutely.
picture.
Right.
So,
Right.
so I think the way forward is to actually develop more, and therefore I think care ethics is a more non-ideal kind of moral philosophy compared to, let's say, deontology or
Absolutely.
utilitarianism,
Absolutely.
right? and
Absolutely.
and and so so in my work, therefore I think that respecting these two insights, we need to there is no way, if we are actually going to look at, not just confine ourselves to the realm of speculative moral theory, but actually think about moral theory in the context of lived moral relations. We There is no way but to work across, or work
Right.
in the light of this challenge, right? uh,
Right.
we may not be completely successful, but we hope to be more successful than other existing
Yes.
resources,
Of course.
is
Of
is
course.
that.
Of course.
But that is exactly the point, to think descriptively, to think about vulnerability, but normatively to safeguard reciprocity. But on the other
Right.
hand, not take reciprocity in the sense of symmetry and equality as unproblematically as the classical liberal theorists, or even Rawls for that matter, takes it.
Right. 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 I think that there's another question. Aniket, could you please share the question? Uh, no, 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 no. I have already asked this question. There is another question. The question has been asked by Rai. Yes. Another question is Marxist communism, which speak of stateless, classless society, comes from some notions of care ethics? I'm speaking about the theory of Marxism, not the practical application.
Uh, that's an interesting question, right? But I do not think I can speak to it, because I think that is something that has to be investigated. Because in a way, Marxist philosophy provides again a radical departure from the liberal paradigm, right? Because there are very key differences. For instance, unlike the relation, unlike the notion of individuals or rights, so making individuals the center of moral gravity as in the liberal paradigm, Marxism is focusing on particular relations of exploitation and domination in terms of class specifically. Now in that sense, it is more of a relational perspective, but it also then has however, it is not, and it one has to see, I mean, you can actually investigate this question further through your research if you're interested. But I think there are particular issues. One is and there are of course very well developed feminist engagements as well as criticisms of Marxism on this respect, particularly the role of the private sphere. See, because here care as a value, one of the very unique aspects that care ethics brings to the table is the fact that previous moral theories, whether they were talking about virtue or whether they were talking about utility or they were talking about rationality, all these values were values of the so-called public sphere, right? And care ethics actually makes a very revolutionary intervention in the sense that it says, well, look, why are we simply modeling moral and political relations through values in the public sphere? Let us look at care, which has been considered to be just a part of the private sphere, and see whether that can become the basis of thinking about moral and political values. So in that sense, again, I think from a care ethics perspective, uh, there are certain values it might share with a Marxist analysis in terms of the attention to exploitation, attention to relations. However, within care ethics, there are there are also, again, in care ethics, there's a lot of heterogeneity, right? Because Toronto's model, Kitte's model, Nottings's model, there are very, very many differences. What I'm saying, there are many differences between our works. But on the other hand, there are also certain critiques that can be developed in terms of the very value of the reproductive sphere in the context of Marxist theory, right? A critique can be developed from the care ethics perspective. Also, sort of, there's a lot of emphasis on group, but at the cost of the individual, right? On the other hand, at least in the version that I am putting forward, I think this understanding of reciprocity also needs to, and that actually I talk about that in the Decolonizing Solidarity and Reciprocity paper, that we need to attend to individuality without lapsing into individualism. This is another challenge, because the
Right.
liberal paradigm, when it's thinking about the individual, it is thinking about the individual more in a very, as a very self-sufficient unit for moral and political theory. Care ethics focuses more on the relation rather than the individual. On the other hand, partly I think that in the context of the transnational intervention, etc., highlight how a focus on the individual is also necessary along with the relation, but we need to safeguard ourselves in from the lapse into individualism. So,
Okay.
so that is the other thing. I actually have a paper on borders, which was published in a volume by Routledge, USA, a few years back, in a volume on contemporary feminist pragmatism, where I talk about the logic of the border and also the notion of the individual that we need to think about. That's not relative to care ethics particularly, but in the context of transnational and multicultural feminisms. So that might be helpful.
It's
But I
very
think it's I do not want to give a quick reply to this question, But hopefully, I've been able to give you some pointers to start thinking about it.
Um, Another thing that is coming to my mind is whenever you were talking of transnational feminism, how will how will you incorporate feminisms of local feminisms rather? How will transnational feminism will perceive this many feminisms together?
That's a
This is a
very
question.
important, yes, and that's a very important question. And actually, that takes me back to the paper
Because
on,
whenever you are making a kind of a difference between the third world and the first world,
yes,
this question comes to my mind that
yes,
uh, there are many plural,
exactly,
divergent feminisms. So,
exactly.
how will transnational feminism address to it?
Exactly. So there's a lot of debate within the literature on transnational feminism. What is the best term, transnational feminism or global feminism? These sort of debates are there. Now, philosophically, how I look at the problem is that if we are actually going
Yes.
to take transnational feminism as a perspective, and if we are to look at it in a decolonizing mode, this is something that I am particularly interested in.
Right.
It has to incorporate some understanding of cosmopolitanism, but yet also needs to incorporate certain understanding of multicultural feminisms and local feminisms, right? And actually, in the border paper, the paper in Contemporary Feminist Pragmatism, that volume, where I talk about borders as a relation of betweenness, and I stipulate a certain logic of borders there. And partly what I argue is that, look, in certain way, the border is not a very fixed, when we are thinking about group relations in terms of borders, the border itself needs to be thought in an innovative manner, such that it can talk about the differences but also maintain a certain fluidity in it. So the categories, so what this means is that, the from a decolonial feminist standpoint on transnational feminism, we will not simply think about uh, something like Indian feminism, or something like, so for the sake of, as an analytical category serving a certain certain mapping of the world, it makes sense. However, we also need to think about how multiculturalism is embedded in the very idea of this understanding. So how the local is to be understood
Hmm.
along with the transnational.
Hmm.
So,
Hmm.
in that ontology of the borders paper, I have tried to address this specific question.
So,
Um,
whenever actually we are talking of any model of
yes.
care ethics model,
Hmm.
we have to keep in mind about this kind of differences of feminisms rather.
Exactly, exactly. And that is, I think that is why this decolonizing question needs to be asked of care ethics.
Hmm.
And it needs to then, so for instance, this whole transnational intervention is not, we are not, Mohanty, myself, Narayan, we are not taking third world, first world as this fixed categories, right? But
Absolutely,
more,
absolutely. I do have a little bit of uneasiness with it,
yes,
but
but we were actually, I don't know if I said it there, but in our works, it is always, that's why I said the third world Mohanty says the third world difference is a kind of discursive category to a certain extent.
absolutely.
But I would think it's also a material category, because it actually orders material relations on the ground.
Yeah, but
And
this kind of differences is a kind of these are all words of violence actually that you told
but
epistemic violence. Hmm.
Exactly. But on the other hand, when we look philosophically, they actually perform a certain conceptual function in terms of categorizing, mapping,
Absolutely. Hmm.
understanding, right? So
Hmm.
in my work on transnational surrogacy, in my right now, as I was talking about my work and Narayan's work, a part of the issue is that, look, the point Narayan is making, that the fact that the colonizer is thinking, or approaching the colonization relation as a relation of care, right? is a matter of epistemological perspective, right? Which is very different from how the colonized is looking at the relation.
Right,
So
right.
therefore, these terms, one way to actually uh, we have to operate with certain terms to also make the violence visible, right?
Okay, okay.
And that's why we need to actually emphasize the terms in our analysis. But on the other hand, especially from this decolonial transnational lens, these terms are not taken either on the basis of how hegemonic Western feminisms are using it, but and moreover they are not taken as something that are reified. That is precisely what is being questioned through the analysis, right? That it's
Right,
it's a status, it's actually a status induced asymmetry, that this
absolutely.
sort of thing is in operation, right? The first world is the normative referent from which the third world is a deviation.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
There is a comment from our very dear friend Shomita Chaudhuri.
Hmm.
Shomita perhaps is here. Aniket, will you please show the comment? Very informative. Looking forward to reading your other papers.
Thank you,
So,
Shobita. It's unfortunate cannot see you here, but
yeah. You cannot do that in StreamYard. That's the
yes,
problem.
but thank you for your comment, and it's good to know that you are here.
Yes, and there are many colleague friends of different colleges actually who are attending this uh, webinar today. I can see Lalita Agarwal from Gokhale Memorial Girls College, Dr. Deepanita Ghosh of our college, Dr. Amrita Bhattacharya, Department of Mathematics. They are all attending your talk, as well as there are many students who are attending your talk. And Shomita is again commented. Thank you, Shomita. It is for you only that we can hear such an illuminating talk from Amrita Banerjee, because you are the, in fact, you coordinated all the things. So thank you so much for this. And I think that there are no questions, more questions. So if you want to say any comment on this today's your experience on this webinar and all, you can comment and we can end with your permission. So there are some
Thank
little bit of formality after your talk. So
thank you so much again. It was a pleasure talking today, and I wish that I were able to see the others, even the icons, but I know that's not possible in this
hope
format.
that we will meet physically to hear you.
Exactly. I,
So
I I would hope that I can do that at some point in the future. But I think so I just want to kind of say that again, this sort of work is quite I mean, there are many facets to be addressed in the
yeah.
context of this project. And of course, slowly and steadily I'm doing parts of it. But I think what we really, when we are doing care ethics, or for that matter any Western tradition of moral and political theory, or even for that matter any Indian tradition of moral
Yeah,
and
I was
political.
thinking about it just now. Okay.
I'm talking about Western because that is my area of specialization.
Right,
But in
right.
the context of any of these approaches, I think what is very important is to ask and situate this question, these sort of issues and concerns from the point of view of decolonization, post-coloniality, transnational engagements, and so on. Particularly because, and as I say, when we are doing the Western tradition, we are not the white male philosophers doing that tradition or reading that tradition. So there are very unique perspectives that can be brought when we are looking at that tradition from a very different sort of historical and geopolitical
Right.
perspective. And in philosophy we tend to think of these theories as ahistorical and somewhat detached from their context of analysis. But I think this is what needs to be problematized. So
Absolutely.
thank you.
Actually, in the case of care ethics,
Hmm.
actually, in this transnational space, this ethics of care is actually standing at the crossroad. Basically, it is
Yes.
at the disjuncture
Yeah.
between the tradition and the contemporary,
Yes. Yes.
and that's the tension area. Basically, that
Exactly. And I think that's the same with actually justice based ethics as well. Uh,
absolutely.
and and care ethicists have done a good job pointing this out, that that the very neglect of care, for instance, uh, and the privileging of notions such as autonomy, detachment, epistemological notions such as impartiality, so on and so forth, are actually a mark of the privileged point of view of the moral and political philosopher, right? Because the whole imagination of the tradition has been from this very privileged point of view. uh,
Absolutely.
and, and therefore this that it seems that vulnerability and dependencies are something that are more on the periphery. That's not the real sort of the point of gravity for moral philosophy, right? That so these are more as that this would be these are abnormal cases rather than than key aspects of the human condition.
Absolutely.
Narayan, in the same paper actually uh, uh, that had come out, she had argued that both the colonial discourse, it has been done both from a care lens as well as a justice based lens. So in
Absolutely.
that sense, I find that paper very interesting because it shows that there has been, despite the philosophical difference between the two models in terms of basic structure and values, they have actually sometimes worked together in the project of colonization. These
Right.
two
Right.
paradigms used, and that is what, so therefore this question also becomes very central to justice based traditions themselves.
Truly. Truly. Thank you so much, Amrita, for your absolutely scintillating presentation. Actually, so we enjoyed it. I think all the students and the other colleague friends who are listening to it also you will comment also about today's session. Um, so
And I would just like to also thank everybody in the organization of this, the whole thing, and and the technical support for this as well. I know it is a massive task.
yes,
I
and for that we are truly thankful to Aniket. He's our faculty of journalism and mass communication department,
thank you
and
so
he's
much.
a wizard in all these things, and we are absolutely a novice. So we are dependent on Aniket
Excellent.
regarding this all these kind of support things.
No, no, it
So
it
thank you
went
so
so
much.
flawlessly that this
Yes,
was a
yes,
very
yes,
good
truly.
experience. So thank you
So
so much,
thank you
and to the
so much,
audience.
Amrita. Thank you so much. I'd like now request our IQAC coordinator, Dr. Shati Pal, to say a few words about today's session. Whether Shati is present, she is not available. Okay, then I think that now it is a time for the vote of thanks. So I will give. I end up today's session by giving a vote of thanks to all the participants and to all the everyone attending today's session. I thank truly from the core of my heart the Honorable Speaker, Dr. Ramrita Banerjee, Associate Professor, Department of Humanities and Social Science, IIT Bombay, respected Principal Sir, Dr. Abhijit Ganguly, Dr. Shati Pal, IQAC Coordinator, Dr. Chandrabali Das, TC Secretary, and all the colleagues and the students attending the talk. It is such an honor to get the opportunity to thank you all. On behalf of the seminar subcommittee of Kidipur College, I extend my gratitude to the Honorable Speaker to take out time from her busy schedule and accepted our invitation to speak on this very contemporary topic on feminist ethics. Her illuminating talk will definitely help us to contemplate on this issue from various perspectives. I also extend my gratitude to Mr. Aniket Bardhon, faculty of the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication, for giving technical support to make the webinar a success. And so thank you all. With this, Khedipur College Philosophy Department winds up today's special lecture session. Thank you all.